Farm4Profit Podcast. Take a listen, have a blast. Farm4Profit Podcast. Learn about farming while having a laugh. Farm4Profit Podcast.
Did you notice?
Actually hit my mic.
As soon as you hit record, the mower started. I am not kidding you. I am not kidding you. Like,
It's the studio is a fantastic blessing. We're so thankful that our audience allows us to have this dream come true of our own personal spot. But we must have the fastest growing grass around the building.
yeah, it has been raining a lot.
Literally every time we record, somebody mows.
Yep.
I bet you if we record again tomorrow,
100%.
they're gonna mow again.
Well, yeah, we are surrounded by like 5 yards. So, one for every day of the week.
Listeners, we do. We thank everything that you do. We appreciate you interacting with us, being a part of the Farm4Profit Podcast. Excited to share this topic and conversation with you today. But don't forget, you can send us ideas, farm4profitllc@gmail.com. You can also text in 515-207-9640 or call us. But sometimes texts are a little bit funnier and people get a little bit braver when they don't have to actually leave the voicemail.
I'm still waiting for that good voicemail, though, because we haven't had one for a while.
It's been a little
that
while.
we can play on the show and just laugh at.
Yeah. So we try to take these Farm4Profit shows to broach topics that are being discussed a lot in the ag industry that also lend towards the future and possible success of your farming operation, but ultimately want to take as much of an unbiased approach to these topics as possible. So that's part of what we do here. We also have fun, Farm for Fun shows. So if you're listening to this one and it's not your cup of tea, we're pretty sure it will be. There's more shows in the queue itself, but excited to talk about this topic because I had a couple of our listeners that I reached out to before the show started to get some questions and some input. And the crew that we get to have this conversation with today is very thorough. Mm-hmm. A lot of detail, a lot of educational points. And I'm excited to have our expert, Laurie, on the podcast. Welcome to Farm4Profit, Laurie.
Hey, thanks so much. Thanks, Tanner. Thanks, Corey. I'm so excited to be here.
If we were great co-hosts, we would have asked you how to pronounce your last name before it started.
Let's take a stab at it. I'm just going to say it's Mazer.
I was going to go Mazer.
Mazer?
Oh, a Mazer. Amazing, whatever you want to do, but it is Mazer.
I
Yep.
should have
Boom.
said we had an amazing
You
guest.
could not be a
Amazing guest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
telemarketer. That's what I was looking for.
I love it. So, Laurie, our audience knows because of the episode title, and now we're going to tell them that we're going to explore the process of leased land for renewable energy projects. And we're going to dive into a lot of the details there. But what makes you qualified to help us out and talk about it?
Yeah. So I've been doing this work for 20 years. So I started in 2004, doing utility scale wind development. So basically spending most of my time in Broken Bow and Valentine, Nebraska, and then upstate New York, working on wind projects, talking with and learning about, and then also some projects in Texas. So I spent about 10 years of my career doing utility scale wind development for developers. So most of that job is going somewhere and talking to landowners about renewable energy. And then I moved into doing distributed generation solar, which is the kind of like community solar size stuff. So a little bit smaller than the big power plant. And then the last probably 5 or 6 years I've spent doing both utility scale solar. So the big stuff that's fenced off, it's like big power plant, along with utility scale wind. So I've been on the side of cold calling, door knocking, approaching people in small towns who don't know me from anybody, and working with them to decide if a renewable energy, be it solar or wind, is a good fit for them, their farm, and their community.
So do you think if you were doing your door knocking and wearing a shirt like Corey has on, do you think more people would answer the door or more people would leave it closed?
I am not going to insult Corey on his own podcast. So, of course, I feel like I would be welcomed.
Oh, I welcome the insults.
Starting off, maybe we can get a solar panel one where I can be out there just, generating power on my own shirt. That'd be fun.
That would be cool. And then you could have like a little signboard on the back or something that's like has a has messages.
I think the wind turbine one would be less successful. I'd probably get my hair tangled in the wind turbine
Yeah.
if I had a bunch of fans on my shirt.
So you've been doing this
There are all sorts of good fun.
You've been doing this 20 years.
Yeah.
That's probably there's a lot of wind in Iowa. Tanner, your family
There
had one, right? But it was probably even older than that, wasn't it?
We've got three wind towers had 3 wind towers on the farm, and one of them is no longer functional, and the other 2 are still operational, if I remember correctly. And I think I took a part of that to show and tell in like 3rd grade. So we're talking
90s.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they weren't brand new when I took it to show and tell. So I bet you they're at the end of a pretty close to a 30-year lifespan.
Okay. Is that how long wind is supposed to last, or like a wind tower is supposed to last? Is that 30 years?
Exactly. We call it the rated life, and the rated life of wind and solar are about 30 years. It doesn't mean you're not replacing parts kind of during that process, but if you think about it, it's really just very basic. All of your money is generated by generating power. So if the thing's not operating, you got to fix the thing to make it operate. Yeah, Tanner, I'd be curious if yours were lattice style, like if they looked like a box, or if they were a single.
Nope, they were the lattice, the metal frame that, looked like you could try and climb all the way to the top, and you made it about 4 sections up, and you got scared, so you came back down.
She's not supposed to know.
Exactly. Not to call it an antique, but those are very different, I'm sure, from what you've seen in the rest of Iowa and your listeners have seen in places like Oklahoma and Kansas and everything, where we have kind of what we call the more modern wind turbines, which are just a single tube with 3 blades on a nacelle. A nacelle is what we call the box thing on top of it.
Okay.
So we're going to get way more into the details and the useful life of this, but I want to start off with, I'm always curious, how do these large-scale projects even start? Because it seems like if you don't pay attention, all of a sudden you start to see trucks show up and unload all kinds of parts and assemblies, and then there's major infrastructure installed, and it feels like things move really quickly. But I doubt that's the case.
So before you answer that, you said you had 20 years, but you didn't say, are you independent? Or like, are you with a company? Have you been with a company? What?
Oh, yeah. So I worked for large companies, mostly for oil companies that had a renewable energy arm. So I worked for those companies up until 2019. And then maybe, I don't know, life and circumstances kind of made it so it felt like it was the time to go out on my own and be an independent consultant.
Okay.
So now I work for clients, helping them either acquire projects from other people or build and think about their own. Kind of what we call greenfield is where you have like just an idea, which kind of gets to Tanner's question, which we'll get back to, or the idea that it's someone else's idea and they don't maybe have enough money to carry it all the way through, so you go out and acquire it. Okay. So those are the kinds of projects that I've been working on for clients, is I help them do the development, which means getting the permits, figuring out if it's the right spot, keeping that relationship with the landowner and the local community, and kind of moving the project forward. And I will say, it does not feel fast when you're doing it, but I can understand new stuff, and I imagine it feels like it's all of a sudden just there.
Yeah, that was a good question.
Yeah.
I was curious myself, because I was like, well, I was assuming you were a consultant now, just the way, but I just wanted to make sure.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm not repping any one particular renewable energy company. And I kind of, after all these years, it feels really good to be doing development exactly the way I want to, and really be trusted by my clients to do that, which probably leans a little heavier onto the engagement and talking folks through the pros and cons in a more direct way. I've never been a hard sell kind of person. So that's kind of where I'm at.
So that's, to me as a landowner and farmer, that's valuable that you're not with a certain company. I feel like you don't have that bias to push. I just in the first 8 minutes of talking to you, I feel like you would tell me whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, in this area. So I guess you have that air about you.
I always try to think about what I would advise my own parents or what I would advise a friend or family member about renewable energy. And we're not here. No one should be here pressuring and pushing you. Because what did we talk about at the very beginning was just this like 30-year lifespan. Like, how often do you get to choose something and say, like, for the next 30 years, I'm going to be looking and dealing with this thing? And I don't know about y'all, but like the only thing I think about that on that time scale, I don't even think of my kids. Like, my kids hopefully won't be in my house for 30 years.
Yeah.
So, it's like, it's a neighbor that you really got to figure out exactly how this is going to work for you. And I think one thing that I really like bringing up is just how customizable this whole endeavor is. You can say this 640, not this 640, this section, this half section, or like, I want to preserve, this part, this tree was important, or this windbreak that we have, you have out there. There's a lot of ways to work together on these projects that I think can feel real hard because, I don't know. I'm not an expert on farming, so I go in with a real open mind, and I assume my landowners aren't experts on wind energy, so we both have got a lot to learn, and on solar too. So yeah,
That's
how
great.
I approach things.
So, Laurie, we've had an episode that we've put together on what I'm going to say is household solar. Mm-hmm. We talked about adding those to animal confinements and machine sheds and homes. But this is what we're talking about are more larger scale projects. So now let's walk us through the steps. How does a larger project, first define size for us, and then how does a project go from beginning to implementation?
Exactly. Yeah. So we'll maybe just like contrast it, start off with what your listeners might be familiar with, which is, like you said, just like a roof mounted or even ground mounted solar farm or wind energy turbine, where the energy, I assume, Tanner, the one on your property, y'all are using that. You use that to offset your own electricity bill. And it generates power and interconnects, like plugs into the grid at a voltage that's nice and low. That's chill. It's like the distribution grid. It's the grid that you all use to keep your lights on, and it's at that voltage. When we get into utility scale projects, those projects are generating power at a voltage that's like a gas plant or something else, like a traditional power plant. So they are, usually we define it in megawatts, which is like the number of like you think of a watt for a light bulb, and these are a million of those. And we talked about those projects being closer to 50 to 100, where they're serving thousands and tens of thousands of homes. So kind of like the way you would build a big power plant, and then everybody in your community is buying power from that big power plant. That's the way these projects work. So utility scale is usually sold not direct. The power is not sold directly to consumers. It's sold through a utility to consumers. So like Oklahoma Gas and Electric, or like Ameren or Mid-American, they would buy the power and then they use it as part of their energy mix to sell out to their customers. And the thing about renewables is the fuel is free. I mean, and I don't think of it as completely analogous to farming, because long gone are the days when you're just using the sunlight to grow things. But we really are using just wind and sun to create power. But I think you talked about how do we get there? So it's really funny. We have these people, kind of our the guys where the ideas come from. They're meteorologists, right? They're folks who know all about the weather. So they tell us where the best wind is, and then they tell us where the best sun is. And probably wind is a little more finicky about best, where it's best. Is it only blowing in the middle of the night, or is it blowing all day long, or is it blowing so hard that the wind turbine actually won't, is it a hurricane basically? Like that's not going to work. But is it a nice steady wind resource? Usually, I talked before about how I don't know a lot about farming, or I go out with an open mind. Usually the landowners that I talk to, they're like, yes, lady, thanks for telling me it's windy. I've known that. Like, I park my car a specific way so my door doesn't blow off. I remember being in Tucumcari, New Mexico. They were like, you idiot, don't park your car that way, you're going to rip your door off. So people are very aware of the wind direction and the wind speed of where they live. Yeah.
Yeah, I can say
so
in Iowa.
meteorologists, yeah.
It blows all the time.
What?
It blows all the time in Iowa, I can tell you that. That's why we have so many wind turbines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we call that the resource, right? That's the resource, the wind resource or the solar resource. So you got these meteorologists telling you, but sometimes the place they tell you is in the middle of a part of the country that doesn't have good power lines, right? So you got to kind of have the power line, or you got to build it, and you got to have the resource. And also, not on a national park, not on conservation land, not somewhere where people are going to see it from, from a view shed that's important for any number of reasons. Not on land that's been marked as a conservation habitat, not on land that's in a real migratory bird path. So there are a lot of things from a permitting standpoint. And then the other layer is, what does the local community already think? Do they have a permitting? Can you go out and get a conditional use permit? What does the zoning look like? What is the interest and appetite? Also, what does the property tax structure look like? Because when we put stuff on your property that's worth millions of dollars, how is that going to be taxed? And so we need to understand that, and we need to understand what that money is going to do in the local community. And we need to promise the landowner that they won't bear any of those impacts. So if I made it sound like a lot, it is. Mm-hmm. And I even left out the part where you have to go to the Amerins or the Mid-Americans or the Oklahoma Gas and Electric, and you have to say, hey, I got an idea for 500 megawatts of wind. And then they have to study what it'll do to the entire grid, sometimes in the tri-state area, to put that much power on, and how they're going to balance the system and be able to deliver safe and reliable energy to everybody, which is their job. So renewables are intermittent, right? So it's an extra thing. It's not a power plant you can just turn on and off. We do a lot of predicting, but yeah, so it's all of those pieces come together, and when they all do, and you run a big financial model, which I'm sure is familiar, to folks doing work where you're figuring out your yields, you're figuring out the costs of all the different parts. And when you look at it and you say, I might actually make money on this for a reasonable power price, then you have a project that starts to go forward. Is that too much in the weeds, y'all?
No.
Have I lost you?
That's a lot.
You did not lose us.
I know.
I'm trying to strategically think of the next direction I want to go, because I think I
it's-
wrote down 7
It's
questions.
Tanner's job to flow the show, and it's my job to mess him up.
So I paused strategically for him to mess me up, and he's not saying anything. So we're going to go
Uh-oh.
my route.
And if there's a pause, I'll just fill it. So I'll do better at pausing.
Yeah.
How about that?
You're good. So I know that you said that wind and solar are intermittent. So can we store power? Can we generate a bunch of electricity from wind this day and just send it in a loop until we actually need it to turn a light on?
So this is the coolest thing that's happened. I don't know what the coolest development, I don't know. When I talk to my landowners and they're telling me, they can tell me what the yield was on this specific acre for the last 5 years based on a computer and their machine, I am blown away. And what blows me away is that I have been in this business for 20 years, and in the last 5 years, we just started to have batteries that have what's called a 2-hour to 4-hour duration. And when you talk about that, it means that the battery can hold that power for 2 to 4 hours and then disperse it out. So there is a little bit of that. Probably back in the day, and something that's still out there is this idea of what's called pumped storage, which you imagine is just, there's lots of different variations on this theme. It's that you generate renewable energy hours, you're generating all these electrons, and maybe to Tanner's point, they're not useful right now. There's enough stuff not enough people are using electricity or whatever. So you use those electrons to maybe pump water up a hill, and then it can run a turbine that way. So those were the old-fashioned ideas of storage, and now we're doing lithium-ion batteries. It's probably not profitable everywhere because those batteries are real expensive, but they are starting to show up mostly in places like West Texas, where when we talk about a wind resource, boy, is that windy out there. Mm-hmm. And they got a lot of land. So they are generating power, and there's not a lot of people living out in West Texas to use the power. So if they store it and then are able to send it in more blocky chunks, then the people who run the grid in Houston and in Dallas are able to use that power and predict it. So it makes it more predictable. It's kind of what you're saying. Like the intermittency,
Yep.
it's not totally random. As you all could probably tell me the windiest parts of the day, and kind of in the summer. Oh yeah, in the summer it's always a evening wind. As things are cooling down, the wind picks up, and some of that is predictable. But batteries really do allow for kind of like like just making it into a little block that you can sell, and you can tell someone exactly what you're going to deliver when.
Yep.
With wind, we can get close, and with solar, we can get closer, but batteries have really changed everything.
Nice. We've got a couple wind turbines out here east of town, and it seems like when it gets really windy, they always shut down. And I'm like, well, that's what you're supposed to be doing, is spinning there. What the heck? Like, and then you see these things on like TikTok and social media, like a tornado's coming through or a derecho or something, and they're shut down before they ultimately fall to their demise. And I'm like, no, I want you to go down with the ship. Like, make power till the end. Just keep spinning, you know? Like, I just think, like, that would have been the most power that thing ever produced right before it died.
I want those lines glowing
yes.
when you go out.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, get the worth out of it.
I'm imagining the voice of it being like, I'm not going down without a fight.
It's a captain going down with its ship.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think GE and the folks who make these wind turbines, they do have like warranties and rated outputs and a whole lot of safety things. So they don't love that idea.
Probably.
I'm glad that it would be fun for you, Corey, but I think they'd be mad at us if we ran our turbines in wind speeds that were too high. And that's been the other big development, is you'll start to see like Northwest Iowa, I think, was real popular. That's where the majority of the turbines are. And you start to see them popping up in Southwest because we're building bigger turbines that are capturing more airspace so they can make power and cheap power with at lower wind speeds. So places where it wasn't working before, it now starts to work. You kind of have these, but the turbines get bigger. So you got to have bigger setback from your neighbors. You got to have more studies done and with the FAA and everything.
Yeah, it's easy to look at them out in the field and say, oh, there's a wind turbine. But then when you get down the interstate next to one of the blades, you know, getting pulled by a semi. And my wife used to think they're airplane wings.
Holy crap.
You know?
Yeah,
that would be a huge airplane.
And it's like, holy cow. That's when you really see the scale of these things. They're huge.
So
fully.
What's more efficient for a megawatt, solar or wind?
So I would say that wind is the installed cost per megawatt, like what it takes to install a wind turbine versus the power it produces. Wind is still generating probably cheaper power. But I think what you're starting to see, and I did one of the first projects in Kansas in 2018, 2019. And that was a project where they wanted solar and they put it out. You know, that was either they were going to build generation out in a part of the country or part of their service territory that was suddenly having a lot of meatpacking plants, suddenly having a lot of things cut up that were using energy. So they were going to have to build a huge new transmission line, or they could put solar right there near where everybody was. And because solar had more of a like steady generation profile, like it was during the day, and a meatpacking plant is operating during the day, and a lot of, like those kinds of businesses, it made more sense, and solar was actually more efficient, and the dollars per megawatt on solar made sense. But you're right to ask, and what you see in places like Kansas and Iowa is people are starting to put in solar panels, the utilities are, because they've kind of got all this wind that comes on the grid at one time. And then what are they doing at those peak hours when we all get home from work, or we all come back in the house and we start to make dinner and we turn on the TV, maybe we put on a fan or an air conditioner. You kind of have this spikiness of power, and solar is pretty good at matching that. Like when people are using power, solar is usually producing power.
Yeah, we learned about peak hours. We put in a new grain dryer and some electrical things, replaced some diesel motors on the farm to upgrade our grain facilities, and had to put a bigger transformer in. Well, guess what? Our energy costs went up because of the peak hours. Like we don't have a choice of when to turn things on and all that kind of stuff. So we wanted this to be more efficient, and now our energy bills are way higher. and it's like,
Ooh.
yeah, it was,
Well, maybe we got to talk about getting some solar there so you can start backfeeding some of that power. It's a big deal with the peak hours and the different rates,
yeah,
and we're not really told about it ahead of time to be able to understand. Like, I want a button on my washing machine where I can just program it, like my old VCR when I was like, 10 years old. That took a lot to program a VCR, but I'd like to be able to program my washing machine to go on at 2 a.m. when power, and you should be able to program and be able to work things as,
yeah. We actually
to take
had
advantage of.
we had the power company come out and had a meeting with them because of this deal. Because it's like, hey, we did this to be more efficient, not to pay more money,
Yeah.
and look into solar. We've looked into solar on hog facilities and things like that before, and
Mm-hmm.
our power company does not net meter, so
Ugh.
we're kind of
Yeah,
handcuffed there by the size of our
you are.
system. And then I'm like, can you at least tell us when peak times are? Well, we have a prediction, but we don't know. It's like, you can't tell me you can't create an app or a website. Like, how much power is flowing to go, hey, you probably shouldn't turn stuff on, or yeah, you're good to go. And they just really didn't have an answer for us. But we're small potatoes, so I don't know.
But you really literally just predicted the future, Corey. Like, that's exactly where things are going, and where we talk about when we talk about investing in transmission and interconnection infrastructure. That's exactly where we're going. You hear these things about smart meters, but that's really what it is. It's a meter that tells you, hey, dummy, like, don't use power right. You really want to run the washer and the dryer at the same time because you're costing 10 times more than it would be if you wait a couple hours. So
Yeah.
we're headed that way. We're just not that way. We're not in that place yet.
Yeah. I should preface that our price per kilowatt is actually lower, but because of the peak times, our bill is
Sure.
higher. So it's like we went down to 4 cents a kilowatt from 8 or 9, 10, something like that, and yeah, it's just kind of nuts.
All right, Laurie.
Well, yeah. And I won't rub it in your face, but there is a thing when we do talk to your utility, we say to them, we're going to offer you the same power price for the next 30 years. You know what I mean? Because our fuel is free. Once we install the thing, we know what it's going to cost. And so that's the part that, that peak hour, peak use, what we help with the utilities is we help them flatten out what power costs will be in the future.
So is that something like, would me on the farm like hire you as a consultant to come out and help with that kind of my problem, or is there people like that? Because I'm going to say
I don't think your project's big enough.
Probably not, but for stuff like that, because I'm going to say we used the like REAP grants and things like that, trying to be more efficient, trying to do this, trying to, lower our costs. And it literally did the opposite, because I would be lying if I told you I didn't look into a giant LP bullet and a generator, because it's like, well, heck, I can make my own power by turning that on at peak times and be way more cheaper,
exactly
per month. And I'm like, so we kind of went backwards in that sense.
Yeah, and the not net metering is a real, you know what I mean? I do understand from the utility perspective, a bunch of random electrons coming on and off and that kind of stuff would be hard for them to deal with, but it's not that hard. They manage a pretty dynamic system. So tackling that and talking to them about, changing their policy on net metering would be huge, because most of the time you're going to be self-consuming, right? You're going to be using, and they're, and then sometimes you'll be sending some electrons back into the grid. But yeah, it's a real, so no, the stuff I work on is a little bit bigger, but there are programs called like community solar where you would basically, where the utility would help you, or a bunch of neighbors would buy power from a local kind of mid-sized power plant that was on somebody's, and you would get that same thing that I just talked about. You'd get flat energy pricing for as long, for the next whatever it was, because that's a predictable, and you'd be buying power kind of directly. It's mixed into the grid. You don't put a little paint on the electrons and know that they came from your neighbor's farm, but you could, that's another way that they've started to tackle kind of the real hit to ratepayers around how much those peak hours can end up costing you.
Yeah.
All right, Laurie. So from our audience, we know that your job is not as easy as you make it sound, because we've got a lot of feedback in preparation for this show, and there's a lot of our audience is on social media, and we've seen a lot of campaigns going around the farm community right now that says plant corn, not solar. Or I've got a 19-year-old son that wants to farm doesn't want to wash solar panels.
Yeah.
A lot of the agricultural community needs information, whether it's in favor of or against. Our audience is very educated.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to know, how do these projects work together with the farmer?
Yeah. So I think the way probably it's really easy it's better to talk about them separately, because the issues with solar are different than the issues with wind. And if you get approached by both, you're going to get different economic terms and different concerns and pros and cons to work with. And I think that's real key for folks to understand. And just my main thing to everybody, if you feel at all uncomfortable, or you feel like you're being pressured, or anyone's pushing you towards something, you just tell them to back the heck off. You know what I mean? Like, this is the most important part of any renewable energy project, is the land. So without that, they don't have a project. So people need to figure out how to work with you from where you're at. And I would also say that folks need to find a lawyer, and it should be paid for by the company negotiating with you, but you should be able to pick your own lawyer. And usually what I recommend is you work with your neighbors together, and you kind of all use the same lawyer. So that way you all get the same terms, and they're not over here talking to Bob about one thing and Fred. And if Bob knows how to play hardball, he gets a better deal. And then that stuff can really, these are smaller communities, and you really want to make sure that relations, like I said, 30 of your neighbors are your wind turbines, but your neighbors are still your neighbors too. So, so with wind and ranching, and even with row crops, but it's a little harder with center pivot irrigation, right? So if you got a center pivot, where can I put my wind turbine that's not going to mess with your pivot exactly as it is? I guess you can remove a few sections, you can farm a little less, but wind turbines, the base around them, you can farm kind of right up to 10 feet around them. So you can do row crops right up around them. And cows, they'll scratch themselves all day long, and they will not topple a wind turbine. So they can coexist. You can run cattle on property that you have with a wind turbine on there, with multiple wind turbines. The things that you just want to be, you want to be cautious about. The problem is, and I think the hard part with wind is it's hard to tell you at the beginning of a project exactly how many wind turbines you're going to get and exactly where they're going to go. So kind of to my other discussion, if there's a homestead, if there's a pond, if there's a view, if there's a place on your property that you're real sure you don't want wind turbines, you have to put that in your lease with the company. You have to say this north 80, this half section of a section, like I'm just going to say, not without my permission. You come to me with a plan, you ask me, and I'll say maybe, but this over here, I'm cool with it. And then you got to figure out how it's going to interfere or work with the operations that you've got on site. I will say the only pain in the neck period, in my opinion, with this stuff is during construction, right? Where are you going to put the cattle when there are a bunch of machines out there? Who's going to pay to move them? How is that going to work if and when you get to construction? So those are the kinds of things, the practical things that I think folks need to think about. And with row crops, it's basically $1 per acre consideration, right? It's like, how much am I going to make on this wind turbine, and how much of my farming am I going to have to curtail? Mm-hmm. And I'll leave it with wind there, and there's like a million hours of nuance we could get into, mm-hmm. But that's wind turbines. And then we can talk a little bit about solar, which is really changing with the idea of what we call agrovoltaics, where they're putting the panels higher and higher. But you're growing low bush blueberry up in Maine. You're grazing sheep, not grazing goats, and you're definitely not grazing cattle, because they can kind of jostle and move those panels around, and there's DC wiring that's behind the solar panel, and I don't know, goats are pretty crazy about chewing anything. So you can put sheep underneath, and you can do a better job of planting pollinator friendly kind of local and native grasses, so you're actually restoring the ground. The dual use is a little harder with solar. It's usually fenced, right? We're talking about a power plant that's generating power. So you want to have safety regulations require that there's a fence around the solar farm. So it really is, but I've seen places, where they have basically places for wildlife to kind of crisscross through the solar farm. So there are lots of things that can be done to make it coexist more. You also plant screening around it. So you get arborvitae or whatever it is that's a local plant that you want to grow. So and you're using farm fencing, you're not using razor wire, we're not trying to make it look like it's out of place, but it really is less of a, you can't, it's a little harder to do dual use on solar, which is why you get paid a little more per acre. So solar, you get paid per acre, and usually wind turbines, you get paid for the number that are on your parcel.
Okay.
I just imagine a goat biting that DC wire, and like in a cartoon, all of a sudden you could see its skeleton and it's just shocked.
Heck, the goats would eat the metal stand.
Right.
They'll chew on anything. But this agrivoltaics you talked about, I got to actually go tour. 6 miles up the road, Iowa State is doing a project with, I think, Mid-American Energy, and little 10, 15, 20 acre deal. But yeah, they have all these different heights of solar panels and different arrays, sizes of solar panels, and ones that like move with the sun and things like that. And then they got plants underneath of them, like you said, different plants that don't need full sun, right?
Totally.
And that's cool.
Yeah.
But to me, I was going to say before that, I probably was on the, I never get too extreme, but I was probably on the side of like, yeah, we don't need them. But okay, this is an opportunity that it's a very good price, what I've heard for leasing the land, and then you're telling me I can still use the land for ag? Okay, now I'm double dipping, right? Like now I could have a community garden or something like that out there that's kind of cool, and it's like, so that brings a little bit more validity to it in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I think that's a really good acknowledgement of some of the challenge that we have. And like you said before, if I don't like to make it this stark, but there are farmers that I've worked with. Dairy kind of collapsed where I'm from in Pennsylvania. So it was hard, and it was hard to hold on to a farm. So coming out and putting solar allowed folks to keep the farm. And in 30 years, who knows? Who knows who's going to be here and who's going to want to farm it, but it allowed for that property to be passed on with a guaranteed income stream to the next generation. If the next generation knows that they want to farm and that they want to run cattle and they don't want to do it along with receiving wind turbine payments, then that's a choice that you make as a family. This is not, no one can come out and eminent domain your property and force you to put anything on it. But the idea is that you can use, I think one of my landowners in Nebraska called it a nurse cow. He was like, that wind turbine's just going to sit out there and spit out money, and I'm going to run cattle around it, and I'm going to keep doing my business, but I have a guarantee that in the bad years, that wind turbine, the wind's still going to blow. And that's another thing. When you're leasing, you always negotiate. I'm saying this to your landowners. You always negotiate a minimum, right? Is it your fault if the wind turbine, had a broken part or something and needed to be down? You want to be paid a guaranteed minimum every year that you feel comfortable with. And so you can work on things like that will really, start to make the economics either make sense or not make sense, but where you're tailoring the project to fit how you want to use your own personal property. And I think the part that gets hard is if you and your neighbor have different ideas about what you want to do with your personal property, and they're looking at your thing or you're looking at their thing. Those can be challenging conversations. And that's why we spend a lot of time working with counties, townships on ordinances. Hey, you know what? Your blade's not allowed to overhang onto somebody's property who's not participating. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. So,
What kind of, I know it's probably hard and by the project and state and county, like what kind of ranges are we talking that people could get paid for wind or for solar?
Yeah. So for solar, we're talking in the range, it really does depend on local land prices, but we're talking about $500 to $1,000 an acre. And that's during the operations period. That's when the solar project is generating. Prior to that, you usually get about 10% of that number. So $50 an acre. And that's when I'm just out here trying to see if the project will work. So there is this thing, it's called the development period. And that's when I'm not bothering you that much. I'm calling you. I'm telling you I got a township meeting. I'm negotiating a tax agreement. I'm talking to Mid-American about how to plug in the project. And you're farming. You're doing whatever you've always done exactly the way you've always done it. But then I give you, and this is another piece that I would caution people to really negotiate, I give you a heads up that I'm going to start construction in 6 months. So then now you're thinking like, do I really want to plant these crops if they're going to come in and I'm just going to get crop damage payments, and what do I want to do? And I've even worked with a landowner on a lambing clause where if we were in construction during lambing period, that they wanted us to pay to move the lambs to somewhere where they wouldn't get spooked and they wouldn't have lamb, deaths and things they hadn't anticipated. So you can really work with that. And then those larger payments are what happens during the operations, because that's when the facility's there. But there also should be payments tied with construction start. When it's kind of the most pain in the neck is when you should move out of the development period and into more of those operations type payments, because that's when you're going to have construction folks on your site and on your property, and you should always have a number and know exactly who to talk to and who's in charge, so that if they're barreling down the road and you got kids on bikes riding, or you got kids on ATVs, that they know to slow down, and that and a really good developer will want to do that. They don't want problems. You know what I mean? The most important piece is this land. And so making sure the landowner is happy and that it's working for them has to be the most important thing. But I don't know, handshakes and goodwill, those things I really enjoy. But you got to get it in writing. You got to get it in your lease contract, and you got to get it where it's spelled out, where you know exactly what will happen and who you're reaching out to with any problem.
So 500 to 1,000. That was for
solar.
Yep.
So I was going to say, I've actually heard more than that on some projects,
sure
like $1,700 an acre. I mean, what's the largest you've ever heard?
I think right around 1,700.
Yep.
Some of in the Northeast and maybe smaller sites, you'd get that, or you get a little bit larger.
Yep.
I haven't heard more than like 1,750.
Okay. And then what about the wind generation?
Yeah. So there you're talking about maybe like between $3,000 to $10,000 per wind turbine that's installed
Per year?
And per year. And when I came up in the business, what we did is we did this really complicated production payment.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Which was megawatt hours times this, times 1,000, times the size of the turbine. And so I spent a lot of time telling people there are 8,760 hours in a year, and the wind turbine is going to generate this, and this is the capacity factor. And now I think folks have really moved towards you're going to have one or two of these on your property, and each one will bring in this amount of money. And I think there can be ways to negotiate in installation payments, kind of those construction payments, that kind of thing, where you get paid maybe a lump sum for each turbine that's installed the first year. And then you get these kind of, rent payments. But solar is based on a per acre because you're taking up the land, and that dual use is less applicable. Wind turbines are not based on dual. They're allowing dual use, kind of farming as normal, as I said, with the exception of center pivots and some of that crop and some of that row crops. But yeah, that's kind of where the range is.
I think when we've had these conversations before this with our listeners, there's probably more opposition to these projects based upon the way the local county supervisors are setting up their setback rules and what land is eligible and so on. I don't think it's necessarily against the renewable energy itself. It's just, how close could it be to my house? How close could it be to my property? But like you're saying, that's for you as the landowner to negotiate. The only problem is, Corey, is I don't own the farm across the road from my house. Mm-hmm. So if the setback is only X feet from my property line, or only X feet from my house, and it sits in the back of my property, there might be one right across the road. But Laurie, one of the other things that gets brought up a lot when we have listeners reach out to us is kind of what my family is going through right now. We're at the end of the useful life of these wind towers, and now there's been bids put out for removal. Mm-hmm. And Grandpa signed the initial lease with this. Now it's our family's problem to deal with. We've gotten a lot of benefit out of the road that connects all these wind towers. I mean, we're not causing any additional compaction to our field, but we could pull out and do all of our grain hauling on gravel. You know, there is benefit that we've received from
And they've
this.
been maintaining those roads, it sounds like, Tanner.
Yeah, for the most part, correct. Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
Maybe not quite as good as a county road, but it is passable. We've never not been able to travel down that road. But now we got to get these wind towers torn down. And my understanding is they've got 100-foot pillars of concrete in the ground as footing.
Below the surface?
Below the surface. Okay. And the rules state that they have to provide the top 5 foot back to the original format. Now, I don't own a ripper that goes 5 feet deep. But it's just
Wilcox
the thought.
Does.
Yeah, pretty much. But it's just that thought, Laurie, that only 5 foot below the surface is concrete and rebar.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so I think so there are 2 different types of foundations for wind turbines. We talk about spread foot, which is what you would see traditionally, and then the other kind. So your technology is old, but people should be cautious. Whatever we're doing now is probably going to seem old in 30 years from now. So you got to be thinking ahead. But the other type of foundation is what's called a rock socket. So you do your geotech, you figure out what kind of soils you've got, and a spread foot foundation would be kind of at that 5 to 7 feet deep. Kind of it goes out like that. You know, it's got to ballast this large turbine, but it's spread out. But then you've got kind of grass growing on top of it and all that. But yeah, you're right. Decommissioning, that's a huge thing. That's something I talk about with landowners kind of till my face turns blue, because removing compaction, repairing drainage tiles, ripping the soil, how many times to get it uncompacted. And are you going to be satisfied with 5 feet? Do you want 7? Do you want 8? What's the thing? What's the letter of credit or the bond that they're placing? Are they placing that bond for removal with the county, or are they placing it with you as the landowner? A lot of permitting processes will have you place a decommissioning bond to make sure that there's money there to take it down. And I'm fully in support, and I think all good developers should be in support of a decommissioning bond. And what you do is you calculate the bond, which also subtracts out the salvage value. So there will be some salvage value, steel, these things are expensive. So you have some salvage value, but you also place the bond based on what it'll cost to restore the land exactly the way it was. And I think exactly the way it was is a real fungible term. Is it all the way down 20 feet? With those lattice towers, why they've stopped using them is because they do require that larger foundation. And it's a lot more money to take it out later. And I think, these are big companies that are making financial decisions. So putting in a foundation and agreeing to removal that they can actually do, makes sense. And maybe, I don't know about yours, but they change hands. And that's what I always tell my landowner. It's not going to be Laurie Mazer standing in front of you in 30 years. If I am, wow, I'll be old. I probably won't remember all the details. So we got to get it in paper so that whoever buys the project from whoever the original developer was, that all the details are there. And and like what Grandpa signed is what's actually going to happen. But I don't know. It's a like you're saying, Tanner, it's a multi-generational decision. And that's where I usually end up. I end up calling a family, and it's mom and dad are out there. And then then the next meeting is usually me and the sons and daughters, or we figure out how to get us all on the phone to talk through it. Because even if they're not on the title of the property, mom and dad already know who's going to get it and how they're going to parse it out. And these decisions are long-term family decisions. And I do think, making sure that all the things that you want to be there are in that lease is, it'd be great if the developer offered them up immediately and said, like, let me show you exactly all the things I can do for you. But truth of the matter is, some of this is a negotiation, and you never up, never in. If you don't ask, you're not going to get. Yeah. So you gotta ask.
It'll be curious. We're gonna see if we like Grandpa still.
Well, I mean,
or not.
Some
when
of
this
the
process goes down.
Some of the horror stories I've heard of farmers having to pay out of their own pocket to take these things down, and you think about this, like, you say there's a bond, but like if this company goes belly up, or say we just discover some other source of electricity or power, in 10 years that we don't even know about now, and these things just go obsolete. If that company is done and has no money left, how do they pay to take it down?
That's the bond.
That's the bond. So
About.
they have to start that at the beginning.
Bonds, and you want to make sure, like, your lawyer will tell you all the things, but they the credit rating, how they're held, how they're funded, that you get an audit every year, that every 5 years they reevaluate the decommissioning cost and they make sure that they've got enough money in there to save it. I mean, the only thing I could say to y'all is I think this is a really viable way to make some more money for some folks for whom it's a really good fit. It's a really strong way to get energy independence, to have these kind of homegrown projects. But if I've made it seem not complicated or not something you need to think long and hard about, then I haven't done my job, because it really is. It's something that has so many benefits, but you are picking a 30-year contract, and you gotta figure out how this will actually work. So I think it's a really great thing, but I think it's also something that needs a lot of time and energy put into it. And kind of just to go back one more to Tanner's point about ordinances and like what you control, what happens on your neighbor's property, that's where it's real important to see these community meetings and to talk with your neighbor and to say, like, hey, I'm concerned about X or Y. Developers should be able to tell you, what's the danger? What happens if, what if its urban moves around? They yaw, they move in a kind of to face the wind. What is it going to ever be overhanging on my property? It should be what we talk about is 1.1 to tip height, like as far as extended up, at least 1.1 times from the nearest property line. So that even if the whole thing toppled over, it would never topple over on a piece of property that was not committed to the project. And noise studies and glare studies, those are things that are real commonplace in my industry. We don't want you to wake up and go, oh my goodness, this thing is affecting my quality of life day to day. We even did, back when there was less digital television, we did like radio wave studies to make sure you're not interfering. We work with the FAA, with the DOD to make sure that the project's not going to interfere with any of the radar tracking and things like that. There's a heck of a lot of permitting and figuring out, but it doesn't mean that local input at the local level about like what's going to go on, who's going to be here to maintain the roads, how is that going to look, what's it going to look like, what are we going to do during construction as a community, and what is the tax benefit? Are my kids going to get a better school because of this? Are we going to get a new fire truck? Are we going to get long-term benefit from this project, from the tax base? Is that, how can this help us? That's, these are.
It's like you're in our local communities, because it's almost as divisive as an election. And it is. Both sides come at it from their point of view, which is fine. Everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but you hit it spot on. The ones that are in favor are stating about the benefits to the community and the revenue sources that it's going to create and the thoughtfulness of setbacks and where this could be mapped out. And just the overall, like, I'm going to go fight for my country. I'm creating a independent source of electricity. And then you flip it. And you've got the ones that say it's an eyesore and it kills animals and it is prone to developing more storms. I love that conspiracy theory.
Oh, I have seen that. Yeah,
that's a little wild for me, I have to admit. I don't disparage anyone's deep thoughts, but that one gets a little wild into the place where I'm like, if we had that would be incredible.
Oh, say that again.
If we had the power to change weather,
yes,
that would be. I would feel like we'd be capitalizing on it a little bit more than we are. So,
I do think in our area, the comment has been made is I don't remember the wind blowing so much before the wind tower showed up.
Yeah, turn the fans off.
It's just you just didn't realize it because it wasn't spinning over your shoulder.
Exactly, that reminder. But I will say heating and cooling. So we talk about my nerd point, my science girl point is that like all wind power is actually solar power, because it's the heating and the cooling of the earth that creates the wind. So yeah, if things are getting hotter than they've been and they're getting cooler, if that temperature, there might be some increase in wind speed. But we also in the industry sometimes talk about what's called a wind drought, where all of a sudden the wind doesn't blow as hard as it was supposed to in 1 year, and that could be microclimate things happening. So yeah, and I think on the opposite side, there are a lot of folks, the aesthetic thing, like with solar, I can mitigate that, right? I can say like, I'm going to plant some nice plants around it. I'm going to put pollinator friendly. With wind turbines, if you don't like the way those things look, it's really hard for me to tell you. I can't change, it's someone's t-shirt choice. Some of us like a brighter t-shirt. Some of us like a more calm t-shirt.
Here we go
I
again.
can't tell you aesthetics, But I think what I can really focus on is safety, making sure you feel safe and also making sure that that you feel respected with your viewpoint, and that if you have to look at this thing, that there's at least some benefit coming to you, whether you like them or not.
I just had a genius idea. We should commission painters that if someone doesn't want to see it out the front of their window, they should paint the pedestal the color of the field. And then where the skyline is, it changes paint color. So like it is camouflaged out the front.
What if you grow a different crop?
Well, then like you just always have corn in
Okay.
that spot, I guess. But that was a stretch.
You could wrap it.
You could wrap it.
Like the Bush Light Combine. You could have a big old wrap on the thing.
See, Laurie, we're full of ideas.
Full of ideas. I really appreciate it. I'm
Advertising,
waiting for
yeah.
Tanner's painting business to come.
Yes.
Great.
Exactly. So I got just a couple more points that I want to hit. The first one I think we've already talked about, so we don't need to belabor it anymore, but trying to think through everything that can happen in the next 30 years and get the proper representation, because what I took to show and tell as a kid was after one of ours got struck by lightning, and I took part of the fiberglass blade, but I remember my family being the ones to clean up all the shards in the field. Probably something that should have been put in a contract to begin with. So I'm not going to go into any more. We need to think as much as we can to plan ahead. But what I want to go into next is Dave Whitaker, our third co-host, has an argument that once you have wind towers on a piece of property, it actually makes the land worth more. When he goes to sell farms, he would state that it has a net effect to the value of that land greater than that of a comparable piece without wind towers.
Yep.
It's just money, right? Like it's a
guaranteed revenue stream.
Yeah.
Yeah. You basically put, like my landlord said, a nurse cow. You put something out there that produces every year, has offspring, has whatever. It throws off money. And if it's a good contract, I mean, I've seen crazy situations where people have tried to hold on to the wind rights to their property while selling the underlying, like you can farm it, but I'm going to get the money from the turbines. You know what I mean? Wind turbines. I mean, that stuff is too complicated and kind of is like severed mineral rights. It's a little crazy, but you're exactly right. That's the key. They can make property more valuable because they're just revenue on the property. And there've been a lot of studies about property values on adjacent parcels. And if it's countywide and there are wind turbines, then the difference of being a neighbor to a farm or not a neighbor or having it's not going to make that much difference on your property values. And then that's why we talk about screening from solar, that making sure that if your neighbor's getting solar, that somebody in that contract is not only that I put up screening, but that I maintain that screening. If the arborvitae dies, I got to go put in a new one. I got to put in a plant at least 3 feet high or what, you know what I mean? And maintain and make sure these things go. But yeah, I think they can, they do actually, they're a guaranteed revenue stream for a landowner. And when you sell the property, the new guy gets that revenue.
So the next thing that I wanted to bring up was something that I have no facts behind. It was brought to our attention from a listener, but it comes down to the effect on wildlife. So we know, first of all, this isn't the point from the listener, that wind turbines and solar panels affect wildlife, correct?
Yeah. I mean, I think anything that we put, any built things like buildings. I live in a city and we a lot more birds die flying into buildings than they do, but it doesn't mean they don't die flying into wind turbines and that they don't affect it. And as I just said, we talk about solar farms that are fenced, and you build like little, basically little, I don't know, you dig out a little ditch where bugs and bunnies can go through and kind of freely roam. But it does, I am not in the heads of animals. I don't know what they think, but I do imagine it affects them. And every state has like a Department of Fish and Wildlife, and there's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And any developer worth their salt will consult with both of those agencies, because if you mess with a threatened and endangered species, They don't care if you're building green energy, purple energy, or brown energy. You messed with a bald eagle, you're going to get in trouble. So we do a ton of studies to make sure that we're not going to mess with local populations. And if we do, there's prairie chickens. They get scared of tall things. So you do a lot of studies to make sure that if you put wind turbines, you're not in a lekking area for where a prairie chicken would be.
What's a prairie chicken?
The things I've learned about desert tortoises and prairie chickens and mating, and it's crazy.
I know it's got to be a lot like you because you're afraid of tall things.
I was just thinking a prairie chicken was like a pheasant.
I also wanted to make a joke so bad and cut Laurie off about you being full of brown energy, but I wasn't going to do
My
that.
shirt is kind of
so the
brown.
point, Laurie, where I was going with the wildlife comment is what I don't have the facts for is supposedly 7 to 10% of the energy that's produced gets lost between the production, the either wind tower or solar farm, and the plant. So the concern from this listener was, if I'm grazing my cattle around a wind tower, are they full of energy? Are they getting affected?
So yeah, that's not the way. Like, electrons aren't flying around. We don't worry about driving under power lines and getting full of energy, right? Even the big 345 ones or those 765 kV lines, those huge power lines. We don't worry about the electrons just kind of dropping from them. Those are really insulated. And so the wires that transmit the energy are insulated, and they're usually below ground collector. So when we talked about foundation renewable, let's also landowners' roads and underground cabling. Those are the other two things you got to be thinking about. Because all those wind turbines are connected by circuits underground. 34.5 kV, which is a pretty low voltage, but they're insulated and they're underground. So there's these wires that have got a big insulated core around them so that the electrons don't escape. Because the whole deal is I get paid on the number of electrons I deliver. So if I'm losing them willy-nilly into a cow, I'm losing money, and I don't want to do that. So we're insulating and protecting. In the wind turbine, what happens is the power is generated at the nacelle. It goes down to a transformer, and it transforms that DC power into AC power. It converts it, and then it takes it and it transmits it. So all that stuff is encased, and you touch it, you don't get shocked, none of that, unless it's, unless something, I won't say that things don't go wrong. It's electricity, right? Like this power plants, you have skilled engineers and folks who work on these things. So if there is a problem, but a well-functioning wind energy farm or solar farm is not emitting extra electrons. Where those losses come is the losses come in what's called heat. So you guys know how, like, in the summer, you basically have a line that like droops because it gets hot. So the losses come from the loss of electricity being lost to heat as it moves through the power line. And that's the majority of your losses. There is some that's just kind of like absorbed into, as they're moving through, they get absorbed into the insulation around the wires. But from the financings I've done on these projects where people are paying me to figure out exactly how many megawatts I'm going to deliver because they're going to get paid on it, it's usually 2 to 3% losses is what we think of as an industry standard. And most of those are in the insulated power lines, just heat.
Yeah.
Good.
They don't get electric.
No electric cows. I don't want any electric cows. Y'all don't want electric cows.
We don't want purple cows.
They don't get electric. It's just a vibe.
Don't want a purple cow vibe.
They're vibing.
Okay, so last thing that I want to bring up, and I appreciate your time.
And I got two.
And then Corey always has more to talk about. I'm
real quiet, so I don't fit in here at all.
Yeah, I could tell. Yep. Another thing that happens to come up in conversation a lot is when us from a rural area travel to a farm show, like in Houston for Commodity Classic, or in Orlando, or we're going to be going to Denver next year, and all of these farmers show up in a city, and they fly over all these rooftops, and there's nothing on the rooftop, and that is where most of the power gets consumed. It's the most dense population.
Yeah.
Why aren't we putting windmills or solar panels on the top of commercial buildings and leaving production ag land in production?
Yeah. So I think even if we did all the wind and solar that we need to get to like 30% renewables, which we're like at 2 or 3%, we're not there anywhere, we would still only use about 7% of all the farmland in the US. But I fully take your point. I live in a city. I would like to have power because it costs me more. Because there's this, if you think about all the way our roads are clogged, right? It costs more. That last mile of getting the power into the city where everybody's trying to deliver costs more. So that's where we work on what's called distributed generation. And this is where batteries are really playing a big role, where it's like you bring in the power and you store it in the city for those peak moments. And so I think there's more and more work. I know groups like folks like Amazon and data centers, as those things are being built more and more. And I'm just going to say it's not out of the goodness of anyone's heart that anyone does this stuff. It's not because they're, an eco warrior or something. They do it because it makes sense, because they've had an experience like Corey where they're like, holy heck, how much is my electricity bill? And so they put on rooftop solar. And if you don't have net metering, you kind of can't sell that power back. So in communities where you don't have net metering, a rooftop installation is never going to be big enough to tap into a large transmission line. So you're kind of stuck with an on-site consumer or trying to sell it back to the utility. And if they won't let you sell it back to them, it becomes hard. But I would say I'm a both and kind of gal. So like I want it on as many brownfields. If we've got a coal slag heap in Kentucky that's just sitting there, or if we've got a captain-filled landfill, I want to coat that thing with solar panels. But I also want to put the power where I'm not building, there's the rural electrification thing is also my like big passion, munis and co-ops, and the way that rural electrification happened. And the idea of having power that's a little closer to home, that was permitted correctly, that provides income and revenue to people is also a good thing. You don't want to be relying on the power from Lincoln to power, all the way out in Valentine or Broken Bow. You don't want Omaha being the center for your power. So having something a little bit, then you end up with you're less reliant on the transmission system working perfectly, and you're just delivering local. So I think local power makes a ton of sense. I think to get to the scale that we need in the US, you're kind of going to need a both and situation where everybody's open for it. So yeah, I'd put it on every roof if I could.
Yep. Yeah, that kind of answered my question, because it was going to be, we as farmers, access to land is getting worse every year, from whether it's urban sprawl or whatever. Just it's tough, right? So my argument was going to be like, why don't we put it on less productive ground, or the corners of, you said center pivots, they don't grow that much in the corners. Why don't we put it in the corners? Type of stuff like that.
Yeah.
But, so. And
that can happen. And I think there are a lot of incentives to put things. There are federal incentives to put projects. The federal government pushes you to put them on brownfield land, on land that's been, contaminated. And then they also push you to put them on federal land. So the Bureau of Land Management, which has always done a lot of leasing to oil and gas and to horses and things like that. The Bureau of Land Management, the federal government, also leases land to us. We just still need it. There's just a lot.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I've got two, and then Tanner sent me one more on my watch. You're so sneaky.
When I'm done with my questions, I have to be done.
This was one of my questions when I went to that agrivoltaics tour. Was like, okay, clearly this isn't going to be, I have this 160 acres out in the middle of nowhere. I want solar panels. Well, you don't just get solar panels. You have to be kind of on the line or next to a transmission, right? So you have to kind of be strategically placed, correct?
Yeah, having access to transmission and the distribution and the electrical system makes what makes a project possible. I mean, there are wind projects more particularly, because the economics where you would build a tie line, you would build a longer transmission line to tie you into another line. But yeah, that's not as common.
So me as a land investor, that tells me the land next to a transmission that's going to be on this project that no one maybe knows about might be a good buy. How do I figure out where that's going to be?
Substations and transmissions. I mean, you all know your communities and your electrical grid almost better than I do usually when I go out there. If I'm like, wait, where's the substation? Nobody may call it that. They call it just, it's that big box that sits underneath the big line with a switching station around it. And so, yeah, understanding where the transmission lines are and what voltage they are, like if that's the local co-op that owns the line, or if it's a larger kind of line that moves power larger distances. Those are some things. And then windy and sunny, looking for the resource there. So not the same way you'd pick a productive acre of cropland, you pick a productive acre of renewable energy land as an investment.
Yep. And then my last one before Tanner's.
You're just not going to let that go, are you?
No. Would this even be a thing, like say the government quits incentivizing it, they find that other, would this be able to stand on its own without government?
Yeah. I will say that 30% tax credits that we get, they put us on par with what coal and nat gas and a lot of the other power supply, like the ways in which those industries are subsidized as well. And this puts us in there. But we've been having step downs in our tax credits, and we've been figuring out more efficient technology and different ways to reach what we call grid parity, where the energy that we're generating is the same price as the newest, is whatever the next megawatt that the utility has to build to meet load. And we've had crazy load growth, data centers and things like that have been popping up in the middle of the US. And so this load growth can cause a spike in electricity prices. So we're kind of scrambling to meet the demand of more and more energy consumption. And yeah, these projects they can stand on their own. I won't say that those tax credits don't make the returns really great. But what they also do is they make the price that we sell the power at much cheaper. So in that way, it's a subsidy to all of us. You're getting cheaper electricity because it costs me less because the person buying it can use the tax credit on a federal level, like a GE or someone like that. They use that tax credit. And then it's part of the value baked into my project.
All right, you can ask your tax question.
You want me to ask the question?
Last question.
Yeah.
He waited and waited. What you mentioned early on, that this is something to consider about what it does for property taxes. You add a multi-million-dollar project onto your piece of ground, and it's going to change that. But does this affect the community that we live in? Is there a benefit to the fire department, the school, anything else?
Yeah, so depending on what your tax structure is and what's negotiated, it can have a real material effect. A state like Ohio made a state law that says it's $9,000 a megawatt installed of that people have to pay. So that's a huge, and that goes directly into the local general fund. And then the only complication that we sometimes run into is like when you pay a community, it usually goes into the general fund. So you can't say like, I'm going to designate this payment just for schools. It kind of gets milled out. Like the millage is the same way y'all pay millage, like a portion to fire, a portion to schools, and a portion to general fund. But oftentimes what happens is, you imagine we install these $1 million of equipment, and then they're assessed. So they're assessed the same way your pool or whatever you put on your property, a new fence is assessed. And then you work with the county assessor to basically figure out a long-term tax payment plan that works, where you maybe say like, this thing's going to depreciate over the life, but the impact to the local community is going to be the same. So let's make a community benefits agreement. Let's make a pilot payment where we're paying you a flat amount every year that you guys can count on. You can budget. You can build that new school. You can, pay the volunteer fire department. You can upgrade your EMS system. You can make these changes. And you can also sign road agreements that will benefit the community. So if they're out there and like you said, the roads, Tanner, it sounds like have been pretty well maintained, that the company is responsible for the maintenance of particular roads to make sure that there's access to things. And then also just the part where, there's a whole education piece that's a little bit more squishy, but it's just the idea of having some sort of monitoring system where local kids are understanding, and that maybe they're doing a unit in school about how a wind farm works and how the solar farm works, and they're getting a tour and they're understanding it. So but mostly tax benefits, and the landowner should always be held harmless. The landowner should see no increase in their property taxes, and the company should be paying their property tax to them. And usually you can negotiate a pretty good community benefits agreement, and that can be done as a board of supervisors or folks who are representing kind of the entire community to see what the priorities are. Do we want to build a new building? Do we want to fund a few new teachers? And most wind energy and solar companies also try to do local scholarships, where for the life of the project, they're going to give a couple $1,000 to a couple kids who are pursuing, either college, community college, extension courses, things like that, and then wind turbine technology training. And the majority of companies not because it's the goodness of their heart, because it makes sense to hire local folks, right? You want to pay someone to drive 4 hours back and forth to maintain your farm, or you want to hire someone local. So there can be a local jobs piece as well in the majority of it. Concrete, rebar, but that construction pop is a one-time pop. So you got to
Right.
really focus on the long-term benefits, which is usually tax. And any good developer will want to have a good relationship with your community.
That
You know,
makes-
no one wants to shove something down someone's throat. It doesn't make for a good long-term relationship.
Right. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean,
Yeah.
I appreciate your time today, Laurie. We might have gotten a little windy on this topic,
You're
but
so
the
funny.
conversation did not blow. But I'm glad that we were here
jeez.
to
Did
shed,
you write those down?
to shed a little bit of light.
You did.
on
God,
the
you're
topic.
such a dad.
I really feel, this has been a shining example of the way that we can talk together and just get to answer hard questions. And like, I'm anyone who's scared of hard questions, who's trying to do something on your property, that's not the right developer for you. You should be able to ask everything you want, get as educated as you want, and make a real good decision. And, for a lot of folks, it's a great economic benefit that allows them to keep a family farm and to keep doing what they've been doing and to have that kind of predicted revenue stream.
So
if they want.
Our listeners are going to have more questions. Laurie, can they reach out to you and ask them?
Sure. Yeah. One thing I would say is there's a website called Crop America, and it's not related to me. It's not related to, it's got the pros and cons that are listed there. And that's a resource. So that's cropamerica.com, and those folks can reach out there. But yeah, I mean, we can talk about putting my email out there. I don't know. Folks can reach out. I think I get a little nervous that the floodgates will open, but I do want to be a resource. That's kind of what you do when you spend 20 years on something. You really want people to understand it and know the pros and cons and not do anything blindly. So that's a big part of.
Well, we will have them reach out to us to get to you, just to.
That's perfect.
Help
that
with,
would be great.
We'll be
I'm ready to play hard question time anytime. You guys can come up with it. Like stump the renewable lady.
Yeah,
there you go.
Well, I would say in a summary of the episode is listen to it again, because we talked about so many different things, but ultimately, this is not a conversation to tell you to do it and not a conversation to tell you not to do it. This is a conversation to tell you to do your homework.
Yep.
And don't be afraid of a hard conversation. If it's with your neighbor who's against you, if it's with a community member that could benefit, whatever it is lean into that conversation in a respectful manner, and you might learn something for itself. So we appreciate you again, Laurie. I know I said that before. We appreciate our listeners. We thank them for hanging out with us, but just do your homework.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I think
one of the best conversations I've had, and I'm thrilled that we'll be in the ear holes of a whole bunch of people. And I listened to a bunch of your episodes, and I really appreciate the work y'all are doing. I feel like it's great to have just a place to go back and forth on the pluses and minuses, and to just start the conversation. This is just the beginning. That's what I'd say to everyone.
Yeah.
This is like the first thing that you do.
That's right.
10 more steps.
It's been
thank you for saying
electric.
Really? You sat there the whole time.
I had to have it. Since you did it, you set the stage.
That's great. Well, thanks, Laurie. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I appreciate y'all, and we'll talk soon. Take care.